I'm here today to talk to you guys about fire insurance, how fire insurance works in Canada, how it historically was developed, and why you, as people who are involved in municipal governance, are a critical link in the chain of the public fire protection model that we have in Canada. As most of you probably are aware, if you've ever made a decision around public fire protection spending in terms of water supplies or fire departments, the province probably doesn't provide much advice. There are no regulations that say a fire department must have 27 members, or a fire department must have 10 career firefighters, or a firefighter must have 5 years of training and certification. Those things are not legislated in Canada. Even hydrant systems are not well legislated. Water supplies from hydrant systems can be highly variable. One hydrant might produce 100 gallons per minute and one might produce 1,000. So who regulates that? It's unregulated. There are several checks and balances to ensure that we have a working model of public fire protection in Canada, in all communities in Canada. And you are a critical part of that cycle. Essentially, the insurers, the municipal governments, local fire departments, local water purveyors, they are the ones who actually ensure that we actually have a reasonable level of public fire protection. But there's no laws requiring any of us to do any of it. And so I'm going to provide a presentation that hopefully will help you to make informed decisions around public fire protection, understanding how you're going to be measured by the insurance community, how the insurance community is going to use that information, and how the insurance community has set up a cost-benefit incentive program for you, the communities, to provide a reasonable, standardized level of public fire protection so that essentially they can manage their losses a little bit better. So to get into this, I think it's important that everyone get a brief history of fire underwriting in Canada and essentially a brief history of public fire protection in Canada. So I'll cover that for a few minutes. Then I'll go into the Canadian Fire Insurance Grading Index, after it was formed, how do we do the measurements, what things are measured, what are the things that we're looking at, so that you know when you're making decisions around fire protection elements in your communities, what sort of things you're going to be judged on and how we do that measurement. Then I'll get into some of the more modern components of how we've digitized the system and how it's presented to the insurance industry, how the insurers use it, and how we connect the dots and create that cost-benefit feedback loop for you and the property owners you represent. So how did this all start? It goes back to more than 100 years ago when fires would wipe out entire cities or large portions of cities. There's lots of great historic fires in our history. If you look up the Great Fires on Wikipedia, you can see a great history of the significant fires that happened in both Canada and the United States. One of the most significant ones happened in San Francisco. It wiped out 95% of the buildings in one fire. That was 1905. So you can imagine the level of devastation to the community and its viability. What a great rebound story. I mean, they really came back from that and they have a great city now. Because without that incentive, communities weren't doing it. Communities were allowing all kinds of stuff to be built. Buildings to be built in incredibly close proximity. Limited or no enforcement of building codes or fire codes, to the point where cities burned to the ground. And the insurers were the ones that were, really taking a loss on that. And the insurers realized that they had to create some sort of a model to solve that. So what they decided was they would put together their own group of engineers and management scientists to study fire protection, create a standardized measurement schedule of fire protection, and then to measure fire protection in every community in Canada, publish an index, and all of the insurers who at that time were at each other's throats, they were competitors. They all agreed that they would use this initial tariff system to set insurance rates. That all goes back to 1883, and the original group was formed as the Canadian Fire Underwriters Association, and it went through a bunch of changes since that time. It later became the Canadian Underwriters Association when they started dealing with risks other than fire. Fire, it remains, and in fact, there's an article published recently on the importance of fire in property insurance in Canada. Fire remains the primary peril of every property insurance policy. So when you get an insurance policy, the main thing that you're getting insured for is fire. Everything else was added on later or excluded later. Essentially, these new policies, which are comprehensive or all risk, what have you, that's a fairly new concept in insurance in Canada. The original insurance model was really just for fire. And today, even now, the insurance policy that you have for your home, for any property that's owned in your community, it's basically a fire policy plus some other things. So you can imagine the importance of fire protection in the premium setting process. The other thing we did initially was help insurers to manage their line capacities. That's how much risk they took in any given area of Canada. And the way that we did that was we produced these maps, which are fire insurance plans. About every 10 to 30 years, we would have a group of surveyors go through a community and create a map of every single building and underground facility in every community and publish these maps and make them available to all insurers so that an insurer would have a library that had all these maps in it, and they could use that to manage how much risk they were taking in any given area of the country, or even in a given area of a single community. They might say, you know, we have a high risk line of business where we're dealing with, you know, combustible sawmills that are not sprinklered. And to deal with that, we're making sure that we only insure a maximum of one per community. We never insure more than one. So they would be using these maps to make sure that they weren't overexposed to any given line of risk. It's important, I think, for anybody involved in making decisions around fire protection to know that there are two lines of insurance in Canada: commercial lines and personal lines. And the grading systems are different for those two lines of insurance. The personal lines insurance has a grading system called the dwelling protection grade system, shown here on the right. We refer to it as the DPG system. That system of insurance really only applies to dwellings and duplexes, nothing bigger. Anything bigger than that flips over to the commercial line side. And that's a much more comprehensive, robust measurement of fire protection. One of the key things to know about the differences is that the dwelling protection grade is a measurement of how effectively you can fight a fire in a typical dwelling in your community. The PFPC is a measurement of how well your community can control large-scale fires based on what you've built in your community. We call it the built environment. So if you have built very large structures, if you have built very large risks, if you have built risks that have close exposures, then the measurement, the benchmark goes higher. So you can imagine in the smallest of small communities, 10 houses and a grocery, a corner store. That risk is very low. Essentially, you could fight fires effectively, probably with one fire truck, 4 firefighters, 1 hydrant. Maybe 500 gallons per minute, and you can actually be pretty effective in that community. But a community like this one, which is much larger, the other end of the scale, it has much larger risks. You could have the exact same model of fire protection, 4 firefighters and 1 truck, and it wouldn't be effective at all. It would be totally ineffective. So essentially, we measure the risk first, and once that risk is measured, we then measure all the other levels of fire protection against that risk benchmark. We measure it in 4 different categories. 1 is fire department, 2 is water supply, 3 is fire safety control, and 4 is emergency communications. So the first one is the most heavily weighted, that's the fire department, and 40% of your grade is made up of your investment in fire protection. And that's your fire department and how effectively they can respond. The second measurement is in terms of water supplies, and that's 30% of your grade. And it's also really heavily weighted because it's so important. Fire safety control is really a measurement of how well you implement and enforce building and fire codes, and everything related to how you're managing risk in terms of fire in your community. And what we see across Canada and across Saskatchewan is that each one of these levels is very different from one community to the next. In one community, you might have a very good level of fire prevention and fire code enforcement. And in the next community, you might find that they don't ever really do any inspections. In fact, we've looked at many communities that weren't aware they had any obligation to do inspections of properties or to enforce the fire code. And they don't have enough resources maybe to enforce the building code. And so they're really relying on engineer stamps, especially in Part 3 buildings where there's a strong reliance on sprinkler systems to ensure a reasonable level of minimum life safety in these buildings. They don't necessarily have someone who's qualified to check sprinkler system installations, somebody that's qualified as a plans examiner. And you, in your own community, may not have someone that has those qualifications. And are you aware of what sort of due diligence you need to be taking in terms of allowing those kinds of buildings to be built? And essentially, what we're doing is measuring you. We're not saying, you should do this or you should do that. We're saying on a scale of 0 to 100% in terms of due diligence that you could be doing for fire protection and prevention, This is how we measure you. And maybe you're measured at a 43 and maybe you're measured at a 92. I'll go through all the elements as we go through. Like I was saying, the first thing that we measure is the fire risk in the community, and we do it in terms, we quantify it in terms of required fire flows. So the larger the building, the more combustible the construction of the building, the more combustible of the contents of the building, the higher the required fire flows. So you can imagine on a scale of 0 to 1,000,000, a zero risk building would be a concrete shed used to store concrete blocks. You don't need much fire protection for that. On the other end of the scale, it's an armory that's used to store explosives and fireworks, and it's a mile long with no fire separations in between, surrounded by smoking areas. So you have two extremes of what sort of level of fire risk that you have. And almost all buildings fall somewhere in between those two. And where that building falls is what we're measuring here in terms of required fire flows. And we have a formula that we use that we publish in the Water Supply for Public Fire Protection, which is a free download for any community in Canada. And we support engineers all across the country to help them to understand how to do those calculations. But it's pretty straightforward. We calculate based on 6 variables the amount of water that we would need. I'll be aware that we encourage communities all across Canada to adopt the Water Supply for Public Fire Protection as part of their servicing bylaw. Some communities do, some communities don't. But be aware, if you're one of the ones that don't, that you should have some sort of servicing standard that correlates to fire protection. So if your servicing standard says, we need to have a certain number of hydrants, why that number versus another number? If your servicing standard says we need a certain size of pipes, why that size versus another size? The primary driver of any of those engineering decisions around servicing is usually fire flows. And there are many ways. I know of more than 100 ways you can calculate fire flows around the world. Right now I'm involved in a big study with the NRC out of Ottawa to determine whether or not our method is appropriate. Because essentially the city of Ottawa is driving this and they're saying they feel like our method pushes fire flows too high. Well, one of the reasons that our method pushes fire flows high is that the objective of our method is to determine how much water would be necessary for a fully involved structure fire, which is very different than some of the other methods you could use to calculate required fire flows. The standard for sprinkler systems, NFPA 13, which is referenced in the National Building Code of Canada, it will result in a much smaller amount of water being required. Essentially, if a sprinkler is being used as the design element for your required fire flows, well, a sprinkler goes off when the ceiling temperature hits 165 degrees. So if we start a fire in this room, as soon as one of these sprinkler heads hits 165 degrees, the valve breaks, 10 gallons per minute comes out, spread over the area. And usually it has a cooling effect. 99% of fires are controlled with that one sprinkler head. So that one sprinkler head is actually very effective at controlling and keeping the fire at the point of origin. And 10 gallons per minute is all you need. So you don't really need very big pipes in your big pumps or big reservoirs to support that. But some of the buildings in this community aren't sprinkler protected. And some of the buildings in this community, if a fire occurred, and we know this because some fires do become fully involved structure fires, how much water do we need once a building becomes a fully involved structure fire? We could use the exact same amount of water, which was totally effective in the fire that we just described, the 10 gallons per minute here, and once a building is fully involved and engulfed in flames, we could put that same sprinkler head above it and put the 10 gallons per minute. The water wouldn't even get to the fire. It would evaporate before it arrived. So that would be a totally ineffective use of water. It wouldn't be enough. So the measurement that we make for required fire flows is specifically for fully involved structure fires. And that's why it is a large amount. We do recommend a conservative amount of water because we know when we look at communities, we look at them in the 100-year picture. We don't look at communities in the 5-year, how many fires are we going to have in the next, year and a half or 5 years. We're saying over 100 years, are there going to be any fully involved structure fires, and how well equipped is this community to handle those? So essentially, that's why our required fire flow methodology results in high required fire flows. And engineers will push back. When you implement fire underwriter survey method for calculating required fire flows, your engineering department might say, all of our pipes need to be upgraded. You're crazy. This is going to be too much. We're going to need bigger reservoirs. We're going to need bigger pumps. We're going to need more chlorination because, it's more water. So essentially, there are trade-offs that one needs to make. And in terms of the environment and the concerns the environmentalists have, they're legitimate. They're real. And I'm not saying that they don't exist. But in terms of providing property protection, we feel that this is the amount of water that would be the most effective. And that's the question that we've been asked. So once we get into a community, we do a community-wide risk assessment, and we do that risk assessment at 3 levels. One is the building level. As I just described, we calculate required fire flows for individual buildings that are representative of areas of the community. Then we join those together and we do a grouping, which we group into fire flow demand zones, and then we group those demand zones into the whole community to create a better idea of what level of risks exist in different areas of the community. I touched on this. The method that we use in Canada is the Fire Underwriter Survey, Water Supply for Public Fire Protection method. You will see other references like the National Building Code I mentioned, references NFPA 13. Understand that if somebody says to you, like, I want a variance to build this building, I don't want to put in an 8-inch pipe because you want, 4 hydrants around my strata. I want to design to NFPA 13. That's what the National Building Code says. And believe me, I'm on one of the appeals boards in BC, and we get that question all the time. We don't want to put in those big pipes. We just want to do an NFPA 13 design. Well, understand what that means. That means that that building will have enough water for that one sprinkler head or the design area of that sprinkler system to be adequately served. But it's not adequate for a fully involved structure fire. So if you have a fully involved structure fire with the system designed for NFPA 13, it's going to be like putting that one sprinkler head, 10 gallons per minute, on a big fire. Totally ineffective. So the problem with that sort of a design, from especially a community perspective, is that you're considering, as you protect your community, you guys are the representatives of your community, you're making the decisions about the water systems and the fire departments. If you allow sections of your community to be only adequately protected for incipient fires, fires that are going to be dealt with in the first 2 minutes, other buildings in that community are going to be very underserved. So you have to be cognizant when you're making decisions like that essentially you don't always want to design to that best possible scenario. To some extent, the core part of your system should be designed to accommodate some of the worst scenarios, which are fully involved structure fires or worse, conflagrations. So what we do is we calculate those required fire flows typically on a block-by-block basis, sometimes on a zone-by-zone basis, and we plot those as lat longs, so it's a pointing on a map, and we associate the level of risk. So the higher the required fire flow, the higher the risk. And we like to think of this as kind of a gravitational field, that the higher the level of risk, the more pull there is for fire protection resources. We group those required fire flows into zones in the community, and then we can say, this area of the community, its appropriate required fire flow is 1,200 gallons per minute. This area, maybe it's a little bit more industrial, maybe it's 4,000 gallons per minute. This area is a little bit, somewhere in between commerce and mercantile, maybe it's 3,000 gallons per minute. And those numbers we associate with a bunch of things. It's not just the amount of water. That flow rate of water tells us the number of hose streams that would be adequate. The number of hose streams tells us the number of firefighters and the number of pieces of apparatus and the time frames that would be reasonable and effective to respond in. So once we've got that risk measured and that benchmark set in a community, then we start measuring just how effective of a response model has the community created. Where have they put those fire stations and how far are they from the risks? So we can analyze on a point-by-point, block-by-block, or zone-by-zone basis to determine how effective of a model of fire protection each community has. And those measurements aren't to say, they're never binaries. They're not saying this is, you need to have 10 firefighters in 10 minutes or else. And if you do have it, you get credit. If you don't have it, you get no credit. The PFPC is set up to measure you on a scale of 0 to 100%. So if we've said that you need 5 fire companies within 7 minutes, with 4 firefighters per company, but you only are providing, let's say, 3 companies within 7 minutes, or maybe it takes you, 12 minutes to produce 5 companies, you would get a percentage credit. So maybe you're getting 70% credit in that area of the grading in that location in the city. And then we aggregate that information together towards the end. A couple of standards of response, just the term, standards of response. I think it's important that everyone involved in local government decision-making needs to be aware of that term. It applies for many different things in management science. Right now, it's being commonly used in terms of ambulatory response and EMTs, how effective they are in terms of cardiac arrest response. It's always been used with fire departments, and more, I think the onus is on every community to know that they have an obligation to understand and develop and apply a policy around standards of response. So in your community, what is your standard of response? how many firefighters are expected to respond. If there's a fire tonight in your community, how many firefighters will be arriving in how much time? Will you have 4 firefighters in 4 minutes? That's NFPA 1710. That is the standard of response that's associated with the National Fire Protection Association standard for career departments. So if you're operating a career fire department, Yorkton, and you had a fire tonight and there was a lawsuit tomorrow around that and your response to it, subject matter experts would be referencing 4 minutes, 4 firefighters. There are some problems with that standard of response in that it actually applies to typical dwellings. So if the risk was anything higher risk than a typical 2,000 square foot dwelling, then the AHJ should have made some decisions around a higher standard of response for a higher associated risk. When we've looked at communities, quite often what we found is that most communities aren't aware of even the terms of reference around standards of response, much less their obligation to have policy around it. I strongly recommend that anyone involved in managing fire departments and water supplies, I urge you to look into the language in terms of reference around standards of response and to adopt a reasonable standard of response. There's nothing saying here that any community should adopt a standard of response that's not achievable. The key issue is to actually measure and statistically be able to quantify what is reasonable for this community. A community in the far north might only be able to say, our standard of response is 0. We can produce 0 firefighters consistently. A standard of response for a medium-sized or small-sized community with a volunteer fire department might be the one that the National Building Code has recently implemented, 10 firefighters in 10 minutes. The trouble is that the National Building Code didn't do a good job of defining terms of reference around that standard of response. They did say that if you're building a building that doesn't have a fire response of 10 firefighters within 10 minutes, that they have increased spatial requirements. And the intent of that is to ensure that the buildings will be far enough apart that adjacent buildings won't ignite and you won't be dealing with a conflagration. I've worked with the people, the architects of the building code, and I can tell you that there are a lot of problems for them with defining terms of reference around fire response. But be aware that essentially that 10 in 10 standard, 10 firefighters in 10 minutes, that's becoming very common. It's increasingly used in more and more provinces around Canada, and you're probably going to be asked about that more and more. So do you understand in your community which percentage of the area, which part of your community can you produce 10 firefighters in 10 minutes in, and which areas you can't? Because essentially any building that you allow to occur outside of that area, you should actually be increasing the spatial requirements for separation between buildings. And that's in the National Building Code. So that's the one standard of response that everyone that lives in Canada, where the National Building Code applies, everyone should be familiar with and understand how it applies to them. The other ones that exist are these two, NFPA 1720 and NFPA 1710. NFPA 1710, as I mentioned, it's a standard for 4 career firefighters responding in 4 minutes travel time, 90% of the time, statistically measured. The other standard is NFPA 1720 for volunteer fire departments, and this standard has 5 separate standards of response within it that are based on population density. So if your population density is sort of urban, a lot of people per square kilometer, there's a higher standard of response, and I think it starts off with 15 firefighters in 8 minutes. And if you're very rural, it gets it's a much lower standard, 4 firefighters in 15 minutes. So essentially there's a range of standards of response that are in NFPA 1720 that if you're managing a volunteer fire department, you should at least know that. You should know what the standards of response are from NFPA 1720 and what your population density is so you can make an appropriate decision and at least be able to comment, yes, we meet the NFPA 1720 standard, or no, we don't even come close to that. And if you're not coming close to it, especially for those of you who are not able to achieve those standards, you should, through policy, actually say, we have a different standard of response. Because a subject matter expert in a lawsuit would essentially be referencing those standards. So if 1720's standard of response for you is 9 firefighters in 15 minutes, 80% of the time, and we look back, as you go through your court case, they look back through your statistical responses and they find out that you were only producing 3 firefighters in 20 minutes, 50% of the time. They're going to be saying, were you totally incompetent, or was your fire department incompetent, or who was incompetent in this situation? Because that is below the NFPA published standard for volunteer fire departments. Now, you would have a reasonable defense to say, well, we didn't adopt that as our law. But I can tell you that subject matter experts will be questioning you. So if you are not able to meet those minimum standards that are set out in the NFPA, then certainly you should set a policy to say, what is the standard that you are meeting? And it's perfectly reasonable to choose a standard that's totally separate from that. You need to choose a standard that is achievable in your community that you can stand behind. And you need to make that publicly known, because essentially if you're in the middle of nowhere and you have no fire department response, no ambulance response, no police response, you need to know that. It will affect your decisions about how you build. You might want a few extra smoke detectors. You might want to think about where you put that wood-burning fireplace. People will make different decisions in their building process and in their personal management of risk if they know that the level of response is highly inadequate. If you got a flyer in the mail saying, please be extremely careful with fire, there's absolutely an ineffective response to your home. There's no way we can help you if you have a fire. Or our response is very weak. We could maybe get 2 firefighters to you in 30 minutes. If you receive a message like that, you might manage your own personal fire risk a little differently and be a little more proactive than if you lived in the middle of a major city where you're really expecting 4 firefighters in 4 minutes. It jumped forward on me. This is the other set of standards of response, and I won't go into the weeds too deep on this one. Just jumping back to the NFPA 1710, 1721. That's the one you guys need to remember. 1710, 1720, and as of 2016, 1730 is the new standard for fire prevention. That's just come out, and so essentially there's going to be a lot of fire prevention officers approaching you guys and saying we need to develop a public education and fire prevention model that matches up with NFPA 1730. And that'll be the standard that really a lot of fire departments are going to be referencing around fire prevention. But these are the standards that you should know. Also know that there are some loopholes in between them, between composite and other types of risks. Neither of these standards talks about any type of risk except dwellings. And neither of these standards provides any indication of a bridge between the two. So essentially, we have one standard for volunteer fire service and one standard for career fire service, but nothing in between. And we know that when fire departments and communities grow organically, that there is sort of a more of a staged model where fire departments typically start off all volunteer and pretty inadequate. Hopefully, as they grow, they become more adequate, they develop better training, better financial models for supporting their apparatus and personal protective equipment, and eventually they get to a point where they're more adequate, and around that point, typically they look to hire a career fire chief, at least part-time career fire chief. In the old days, fire chiefs really were fireground leaders. They were the guys who led the charge on the fireground. But more and more now, fire chiefs are administrators. They are the people who do all the paperwork to manage all the training, to manage the fire prevention inspections, to manage the fire department's finances, to manage procurement. They are essentially, a department administrator. And if you are doing this as a part-time or a volunteer gig where you were really only thinking that, I just want to make sure that my fire department doesn't collapse, so I'll give up my Saturdays to go do this. And it seems like more and more is being asked of volunteer fire chiefs. And personally, in my experience, I think volunteer fire departments are possibly going to become extinct and obsolete. You may only see paid on call and or part-time models in the future. I don't know that in most jurisdictions in Canada that they can keep enough volunteer firefighters trained and equipped to provide a reasonable minimum standard of response in the future. So those of you operating volunteer fire departments, be aware that we are measuring you guys more and more closely and finding there's a weak correlation with effectiveness and response due to a couple of key issues. One, volunteers are less and less likely to be available. So in the old days, volunteers would typically live in the community within a reasonable distance, 8 kilometers of the fire hall they responded to, work in the same community, and when a fire happened, anytime, day or night, 365 days a year, that volunteer was available to respond. Not the case anymore. Volunteers more and more are telling us, we can't respond from work. Our employer will dock me a day's pay if I walk away from my station. So I don't respond. I don't respond from my place of work. More and more employees are working away from their place of where they dwell. So essentially, people aren't even in the community that they would be part of the fire department on when they're working. They go out to the oil patch for 2 months, and they're not available to respond. There's all kinds of problems with training. We had a loss of a volunteer firefighter in BC, and there was a big study around the training after the fact. And what they found was that 80% of the fire departments in BC did not provide a minimum level 1 certification for firefighters. And I'd be willing to bet if we did the same study in Saskatchewan, it'd be the same here. Those of you guys that operate fire departments and make decisions around people's lives and the life safety in your community, are you taking steps to proactively ensure that every firefighter on your force is a certified firefighter, is a trained NFPA 1001 level 1 firefighter? Or are you sending people who don't have adequate training and don't equipment into one of the most dangerous workplaces that we can imagine? So these are the kind of things that we need to think about as people that are involved in the decision-making process around fire departments. And I'm not telling you whether this is right or wrong or moral or immoral. I'm just saying that as the representative of Fire Underwriters Survey, these are the things that we're measuring for fire departments across Canada, and these are the ways that we measure you. So in terms of standards of response, we measure it as specifically appropriate for the risk level. And we measure the risk level, as I said, in terms of required fire flows. So the higher the risk, the higher the standard of response. And the highest standard of response, and I doubt if many of you would have these kinds of risks, but that's up in the order of 10,000 gallons per minute. And I'll just quickly check. So these would require in the order of 10 available pumper companies and 4 available ladder companies. So essentially 14 companies, 6 firefighters per company. You're talking about 70 firefighters on duty 24/7 and available to respond within a time frame of 3 or 4 minutes. So essentially not many communities, number one, even have that high standard of risk that they'd be measured against. But even those that do have that high standard of risk, they likely don't have that level of response. So if they're only getting, they only have 20 or 30% of that, they might be into a PFPC class 7 or 8 community. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with any level of response that you want to provide. Think of it similarly to how you're measured in terms of your finances. You want to get a loan or a mortgage, or your community wants to get some finance, you're going to be measured. Equifax, Standards & Poor, some agency is going to measure your credit worthiness. They're going to use a formula, they're going to use a bunch of data points that they know about you, and then they're going to set your credit worthiness on some scale, which then is going to impact how much they're willing to lend you and what rates they would be willing to lend to you at. The exact same process. It's not to say that somebody with a poorer credit rating is a worse person or they're on track for a less fulfilled life. That's just where they're at. That's the measurement of where they're at. And it's not to say that the measurement system is perfect. It's just one way of looking at risk. And in terms of a bunch of mathematicians and actuaries, that's the way that they want the risk measured so that they can insure and make sure that they're making enough money to not go insolvent if there's a big loss. The next thing that we measure is distribution, and we measure accordingly to those standards of response, and each one of those, 3.5 minutes is the appropriate response times, 5 minutes is there's a whole bunch of different standards for response. Could be anywhere between 3.5 and 10 minutes for first due response to total concentration response. We measure each property or anywhere that we've calculated the required fire flow, each block, to see how effective the response is, and then we give that information to the community, but we also ensure that we base our calculations around that to say this is how effective that community is. Every element of fire protection, from the number of hydrants to the amount of available water, the size of the pipes, number of firefighters, number of pumpers, number of hose streams, every one of the elements, there's over 500 elements that we measure in a fire insurance grade. Every one is measured on a scale of 0 to 100%. And we aggregate those together to come up with the final grade. Similarly to fire departments, when we measure water supplies, we're looking at adequacy of the size of the pipes, of the distribution of hydrants. People tend to think that these things are really standardized, but they aren't. And every community decides for itself how many hydrants should be on one block. Do you need 2 hydrants per block? Do you need 4 hydrants per block? And every community decides for itself how much storage do we need? Do we need 1 million gallons of storage, or do we need 10 million gallons of storage? And this directly impacts how effective your firefighting efforts are going to be. And especially when you get close to the bottom, if you've got a very minimalistically designed water supply system, what can happen is that the water system can run dry during firefighting efforts, and obviously that can have a big impact on how effective firefighters will be. When we're measuring your water supplies for public fire protection, we've already calculated the required fire flow at locations. The second step is the measurement of the adequacy of those fire flows, or the available fire flows. So we compare those two. If we've determined here at this location we need 2,000 gallons per minute, we're going to go outside and say, how many hydrants do we have? Do we have enough hydrants for 2,000 gallons per minute? And if we do, we give 100% credit there. But then we open the hydrants and we actually calculate how much water can we get out of the distribution system at that location if we opened up all the hydrants, if there's a fully involved structure fire. And if we determine that there's only, let's say 1,600 gallons per minute available here, 80% credit for that element of the grading for this location. Fire safety control, this is the implementation and enforcement of building codes, fire codes, as well as public education. Be aware that these things are measured. Typically, because we know that we're speaking to the smaller communities largely in this audience, it's normal that we don't see a very good credit score in terms of the effectiveness of fire safety control. Why is that? It's typical for smaller communities to be unaware of how to set up a fire prevention process, a fire prevention inspection, or a fire codes enforcement process. But it's also common that even with respect to the building code, that they may not have the expertise locally to have a proper permit process set up, and they can become over-reliant on the engineer's stamp and the design authority to hopefully be able to do a good job in design. But what we see when we do our plan review is quite often there are mistakes made, and that's where a local government really should have a proper plan review process where they're actually signing off. They have their own subject matter expert who's representing the municipality's interests, evaluating the plans for any new buildings and construction and making sure they're up to snuff. Firefighting assumptions. Directly from the building code, the National Building Code, from the appendices. I hope every community in Canada is aware of this clause because essentially if you're making decisions around public fire protection and you're making decisions around what you allow to be built in your community, what sort of zones you allow, what sort of buildings you allow to be constructed, you should be aware that under codified law, it is your responsibility to make sure that you limit what you allow to be built to that which you can protect, and or you take steps and additional precautions to make sure that that is reasonably protected. And they reference that maybe you could require sprinklers or other types of protection. There are many other types of protection. If you had a building, let's say that you were, in BC, we're dealing with a 6-story combustible, and more provinces are now allowing 6-story combustible construction. If you come across that in your community and you see these 6-story combustibles popping up, I think it's important that you stop and take measure. You have the adequate resources to protect those kinds of risks. Same with any type of serious risk, a sawmill or a serious manufacturing complex. Any of these kinds of things, when they're being built, you're thinking, I'm sure, about how do we zone this, how do we make sure that we're controlling the impact on the community, how do we make sure that there's enough water out there, how do we make sure there's enough electricity, but are you asking the question, how do we make sure that we are adequately prepared to protect this? Because essentially, once you allow something to be built, we tend to look at it in the 100-year picture. For the next 100 years, that developer's long gone. He's built it, he's made his money, he's gone. But you are going to be in the community. Your family's going to be stuck with that risk. And for 100 years, you're going to be charged with protecting it and making sure it's adequately protected. And that level of risk is going to be the benchmark against which your fire insurance grades or your level to protect is measured. So if you set a high risk, now you're going to have a strong fire department to be able to protect it. Or your fire insurance grades get worse, which affects everybody's property insurance and access to insurance in general. So just be aware that these things are all in the balance, and the more risk you want to allow to be built, it's fine, but be aware that A, you could end up with your fire insurance grades getting worse across the community, or you could actually appropriately request that the developer provide some additional fire protection investments. And when you think about that 100-year picture, what does that look like? Well, maybe you're going to be requiring them to put a fire department or a new fire station right beside it. Maybe they're going to provide $5 million of funding for pieces of equipment that would be used to protect it. These are things that a community needs to be thinking about as they're making a decision on development. The developers, they'll do whatever it takes to make money. They have their own formula. They're not going to do something that's not going to make them money. Don't worry about them. You need to be thinking about your community and how well you're setting your community up for success economically in the future. And if you allow big, dangerous risks to be built, how well is that going to serve your community 100 years from now? I'll just quickly gloss over emergency communications, but be aware that we do evaluate your ECOM, your public safety answering point, your 911 system, and or any other system if you haven't implemented 911. And we essentially measure how effectively your communication system supports your fire operations. Quickly to summarize, how do we end up with the final grades? We start off with all those 500 variables measured against the risk. We aggregate those all together into those 4 categories: fire department, water supply, fire prevention, and ECOM. Each one of those ends up with a 1 to 10 score, as well as a 0 to 100% score that correlates. We present that information on the fire department. For any of the communities that have been graded since we completely digitized over the last 5 years, they'll have this kind of a grade sheet that shows them how much credit they got in each area that they were measured and how much credit they could still receive, which helps them to make decisions as they go forward. That was the fire department, 19 items. This is where we've aggregated those items into the 4 major categories: fire department, water supply. So the very first column is fire department. This fire department's got 74 out of a possible 100 credit points for their fire department. When you're thinking, when we use the PFPC, it's a 1 to 10 scoring system. So how does that match up with the percentages that we've been talking about? Well, it's 10% per credit point. So essentially, the PFPC class 10 is anything below 10% credit. Past 10% credit all the way up to 20 is class 9. Past 30%, class 8, so on and so forth, all the way up to, if you're over 90% credit, you're in a class 1 community. But it's very, very onerous and expensive to maintain that if you haven't diligently managed your risk. Communities that are really diligent about managing their risk, they can actually achieve a PFPC 1 fairly affordably. But I don't know of a single community in Canada that's really been diligent about managing their fire risk, so don't feel bad if you haven't. The other system. So that we've been talking about the commercial lines PFPC system. Now we're going to talk briefly about the dwelling protection grade system. This system might go by the wayside. We might actually eliminate it for Canada altogether because there are a bunch of problems with this system. Number one being, it's a measure of how effective fire protection is in a community for a 2,000 square foot dwelling with limited exposures. And more what we're seeing in communities is that homes are much bigger than that. Excuse me. The way that construction happens, it's more and more open, which means that fires burn faster. There are a bunch of things that have changed in terms of how dwellings are protected that make the existing dwelling protection grade system not necessarily as indicative as it used to be of probability of severe loss. So it is something that we are considering eliminating altogether, because we've been doing an actuarial analysis and it shows the PFPC system does a very good job of correlating probability of severe loss to the grade. The dwelling protection grade system, it's a much more simplified system, and essentially we're just saying prescriptively, this is the minimum number of firefighters you need, this is the minimum pieces of equipment that you need, and it's all published on our website at fireunderwriters.ca. So you can always see any of that information if you go by the website. Currently, as I was just showing, there are 5 grade categories: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3 has been split into 2. The grades roughly correlate with DPG 1 is a career response, DPG 2 is composite response, DPG 3A is volunteer response. Be aware that dwelling protection grade 3B now has an intermediate grade. Dwelling protection grade 3B was typically volunteer shuttle protected, and now we have expanded that to include volunteer superior shuttle protected, and it can have a very significant cost benefit to property owners in areas without hydrant protection. And we have seen a number of communities in Ontario, it's quite popular. In BC, we've just started it 5 years ago and it's very popular already. Alberta, I think the first community just got it last year. It can move dwellings that are in currently semi-protected or fire hall protected dwelling protection grade 3B rates to hydrant protected rates, which can make a difference between 30 and 50% off property insurance, which if you're paying, $1,000 or $2,000 per home across 1,000 homes, it adds up pretty quickly. How do we get this information to the insurers? Historically, we used to publish a big book of grades. It was in the IBC statistical lines plans, and the insurers did their best to use it, but a lot of the times they got the information wrong. And a lot of that had to do with geography. Somebody would live 10 kilometers out of Regina, but their mailing address, they just put, oh, I live in Regina. Because people would know generally what they meant by that. but the insurers would be using the fire insurance grades based on what the insured said. And it turns out that this area that they were being insured under doesn't get protection from Regina, and they shouldn't be using the grades for Regina. So we developed a geo-database that shows the public fire protection characteristics of every address in Canada. It includes a bunch of different layers. The first being where fire halls are located, so we've geolocated every fire hall in Canada. We've attached a bunch of information to all those fire halls, all the grade information and response characteristics. We've also now added in the response boundaries, which in this first iteration, we've just released something called the municipal portal, which we've created a password for every fire chief in Canada. If you have a fire chief that you want him to see this, drop me an email and we'll get him his username and password. So the idea here is that we want to make sure that the fire chiefs and or a representative of the municipality is clarifying for us where your fire protection exists. So essentially in the old days, we know that fire protection models would include fire departments just responding wherever. You know, they would just go wherever. It didn't really matter if they were in the boundary, out of the boundary. But as we've seen in recent past, more and more municipalities are saying, we don't want our fire department crossing a boundary. And we did a study out in Calgary where they brought in an economist that showed them that their responses outside of their boundaries were costing them more than $2 million a year. And so they said, stop that. And they signed a contract with the rural municipality outside, Rocky View, that stipulated that they would provide responses, but it would be based on hourly charges, and there'd be minimum charge rates. And I think it was $1,800 an hour for a pumper company, minimum charge rate of 6 hours. And Rocky View got their very first bill and said, we don't want to be paying you guys, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, so no more fire calls go to Calgary. So that entire area outside of Calgary, or just outside of Calgary, in the Rocky View area, now doesn't get any protection from Calgary. They call their Rocky View Fire Department, which might be as much as 50 kilometers away. They get a much poorer standard of service, which you might think the insurers would not really want that to happen. But in fact, what we want is always accuracy. We want to make sure that the right fire insurance grade is being applied to the right property so they're paying the right premium. And the reason for this is that if the property owner is unhappy with that service level, once they start paying a higher premium, they'll know about it. And then they can take appropriate action, come to you, and say, why did my property insurance triple? I used to pay $1,000 a year, now I pay $3,000 a year. Why did that happen? Why aren't you guys providing me better fire protection? You can then explain to them, if you want that fire protection, we have to increase your taxes by $2,000 a year, because that's what it would cost to support a fire station in your area. People can then make an informed decision as to whether or not that's what they want. And fundamentally, the entire grading model, that is how it's intended to work. And it goes off the rails when property owners are not paying the appropriate rates. And what ends up happening is that they think, in most cases, they have some level of fire protection, and it turns out that they don't. And they don't know until too late. When they have a fire, then they have a big loss. They didn't get the response they thought they were getting from Fire Department A because they don't have a contract to respond, and they're not, responding as colloquially as they used to. They used to just, come whenever, and now they don't because there's a boundary and they've been told don't cross that. Those people aren't paying for the fire protection. If they wanted the fire protection, they can have it. I mean, I'm sure that any fire protection provider would be happy to provide it, but people need to pay for the service. I mean, fire apparatus doesn't procure itself. I mean, fire apparatus, fire stations, firefighters, these things all cost money. And it's appropriate that people pay for that level of service, and the insurers have created an incentive for them to do so. So essentially, it's very critical that everyone involved in this model, from the municipalities to the fire departments to the insurers, to all support the model. The municipalities have to clearly indicate this is where we respond. And if the limit, not to say that we're in a situation where we can't share resources, but anytime that there is a sharing of resources, we need to quantify that. And we need to show clearly on the fire insurance grade maps exactly where that shared service exists and what it entails. And typically what we want to see is your bylaw and or your contract for service. So you have a mutual aid agreement? Do you have a automatic aid agreement? Is it on first due? Is it on second due? What are you sending? Are you sending your first due apparatus? If you're sending your first line engine, what are you going to be using to protect your community while your first line engine is out for 18 hours, fighting a major conflagration? Who's protecting your community? What is your plan for that? And are there some correlating cost benefits? There absolutely are. So we can take those into account where you have clearly showed us these are the areas that we protect, these are the lines and boundaries we don't cross, these are the areas that we don't protect. And we can very clearly show that and make it known to the insurers so that then they can set the discounts appropriately so that there are incentives for people to want to participate in the funding of public fire protection. Each fire station has a bunch of data points. I pulled one up here to show you. There's a bunch of data elements from the Fire Insurance Grading Index that's included with each fire hall. And then we get into the hydrants. And we hopefully have GIS hydrants for the vast majority of communities, although in Saskatchewan we are still missing a few communities' hydrant data. If you don't have GIS hydrant data and you just have a hydrant map, put it on the wall, snap a picture, send it to us. We'll geocode all your hydrants and send it back to you as whatever you like, a shape file from ArcGIS or a Google Earth file. It'll be useful for you to have a digital hydrant map because essentially we want digital hydrant maps for every single hydrant in Canada, and we know that there's some 14,000 water purveyors out there that we need to be in touch with. We have about 90% of the hydrant systems already geocoded, but a lot of the hydrant systems that still exist are very small systems, 5 and 10 hydrant systems. For each hydrant, we have a bunch of information, just like we do for each fire station. And eventually, in the municipal portal I was talking about that we have now for fire chiefs, in about 2 years, we'll have another portal open up for water engineers. So water engineers can manage their hydrant maintenance program directly through the portal if they choose to. We then run an algorithm that creates a fire insurance grade map that shows where the fire insurance grades apply. In this case, the blue area shows a PFPC 3, the orange area shows PFPC 9, the red area shows PFPC 10, and the insurers, when they look up a property, it shows them what the response characteristics are, and it looks like this. Essentially, there's a page, I'll show you the map on the next one, but essentially the insurer, when they type in an address, it gives them the information about what is the grade that's applicable to this area, as well as what are the response characteristics. This is the fire hall that responds, this is the response distance, this is the number of hydrants, and these are the adjustments we recommend making to the fire insurance grade. And essentially, more and more insurers are now directly connecting into this. The insurance business model has not been as profitable as it used to be when the stock market was doing well. More and more insurers are looking to improve their financial position by streamlining their underwriting process. And one of the ways to do that is to, instead of having the underwriter go out and collect all this information and try to independently verify it from a bunch of inspection data, they just want their system to pull all the data from our system and to directly plug that in, and it becomes part of the premium. So more and more insurers are switching to a straight web service connection to this. So the key thing is for you to remember that you need to make sure the information is in the system, so that when you've spent money on a hydrant or you're spending money on a fire hall or a piece of equipment, you want to get credit for that expenditure. And you want to make sure that the property owners that are getting protection from that are getting the maximum credit by making sure the data is in the system. So as we connect the dots and get back into the economics of how this all works, we've done cost-benefit analysis for many communities where we've looked at, most communities end up being somewhere between 80 to 90% made up of dwellings. Look at the total assessed values. And when we look at the total cost benefit for, this is a community that we looked at with about a population of 30,000 and 14,000 dwellings. The typical cost for fire protection in the previous 5 years was $22 million per year for their public fire protection program. This is a career department, not a huge community. I mean, like I say, 30,000. The average cost of a house in the community was around 450 grand, where the total insurable value was 250 grand, so just the improvements. The cost of insurance without fire protection in that community, we did a survey of 5 of the major insurers in the area, and the cost of insurance per year with no fire protection rating was $32.90 per year, and the cost of insurance with the fully protected status was $893 per year. So the difference being about $2,400 per year per dwelling. Across 14,000 dwellings, that's a difference of about $33.5 million a year for having a recognized level of service. So essentially, the $22 million cost per year was more than covered just looking at the cost savings that they were getting on dwelling insurance. Similarly, on the commercial side, the PFPC side, which is a much smaller piece of the puzzle, they had about $6 billion worth of commercially insured properties. and they were saving about $3.2 million per year on those insured properties. So we actually would combine those two, the previous savings of $33 million per year and this, for a total of over $36 million per year in savings associated with fire protection for having the recognized levels of service that they had. It's important also to note that if you're trying to quantify the benefit of investments in public fire protection, it's not just in terms of how much you save on the insurance. The more important factors are saved lives. And we also look at saved property, business continuity. When a community has a major fire, in particular in one of their major employers, we think about how does that impact the tax base? How does that impact people's ability to work and pay taxes? And how does that affect the overall economic viability of the community? Communities that have big fires, sometimes that can actually really devastate their tax base because people move away if their employer has been burned down and they might be without work for years. Globally, the impact of insurance is enormous as well, and I think it's important to realize how stabilizing of an effect the insurance model that we have in Canada and elsewhere in the world, how stabilizing that is on our economy. And it's important to look at studies like this one done from Munich RE that show in the areas of the world that are well insured, these are the light blue areas, there's a significant difference in how catastrophes actually impact us. When we look at the natural catastrophes in those same areas between 1980 and 2009, 37% of them affected those G7 countries where the best insurance, those are the highest amount of insurance per capita. So we actually had the most catastrophes affecting us, and probably we have some of the most built up areas. But when we go over to the pie chart on the right, we look at the number of fatalities, and we can consider this to be a proxy for injuries as well. We actually had the least number of fatalities and injuries associated with catastrophes. So we had the most catastrophes and the least injuries and fatalities. And largely this has to do with insurance. Insurers encourage us to do the right thing and to mitigate and to prevent losses. And where there is not insurance, we're not always given the right kind of incentives. And the fire insurance grading model in Canada is a perfect example of that. The grading model that we have, it's essentially intended to be a positive feedback loop. The way it's intended to work is that the municipalities are given a reason to invest because property owners get reduced insurance premiums for having a recognized level of fire protection service. So municipalities invest in these standardized and superior levels of fire protection service. Fire departments get funded, and as a result, insurers give these discounts. The insurers then see that there are better levels of fire protection and reduced losses, and they have a better handle on what their level of risk is, so they continue to use the grades more and more. And it creates this ongoing feedback loop where the municipalities do a better job of managing the risk and providing public fire protection resources, and the insurers continue to set up this discount system. Is the grading system being used more or less than it was in the past? More than ever, and this grade shows the usage of the grading index. Since we completely digitized, starting in 2008, we started recording the uses of the grading index. And we started off around, in 2008, around 200,000 uses per year. In the last year, we actually had over 2 million uses. So that means that insurers are using it more than ever. It's becoming essentially a standard part of their business. So insurers are not using it less, they're using it more. And the one caveat is that in Saskatchewan, SGI did their own thing in terms of the fire insurance grading for about 2 decades. They weren't using the Fire Underwriter Survey, and they weren't encouraging Fire Underwriter Survey to update grades in Saskatchewan. So a lot of the grade information in Saskatchewan is very out of date, and it's a result of what happened with SGI handling the majority of the property sector. That being said, SGI actually specifically brought us in and said, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't have the expertise to do this. The person that they had that was doing it is not available anymore. And as such, they really want us to get all the information for Saskatchewan back up to date. So we're doing our best to work with communities, and that's one of the main drivers of why I'm here today, to make sure that the communities across Saskatchewan are reintroduced to this process, that essentially you're one of the cogs in that positive feedback loop, where it's critically important that the municipalities provide the data. Then the data gets used by the insurers and appropriate discounts are given, and there continues to be this feedback loop which creates a safer environment for all Canadians. This is a slide from an actuarial analysis that we have going on right now, and it shows correlation between the PFPC and the actual loss severity, and we're continuing to do this study. We were going to be working a little more with the dwelling protection grades as we go forward, but we already are seeing a very strong correlation between PFPC and loss severity. So due diligence is extremely important. I think I've harped on you guys enough to tell you. Actually, I shouldn't say coming soon, municipal portal. It's open. It's open for Saskatchewan as of right now. You guys will be the first to get access to it. We've been working on it for the last 2 years. If you have a fire chief that wants access, we have a password set up for every fire chief in the country to access their own version of the municipal portal that shows them the fire insurance grades applicable to your community. Soon we'll have comparative analytics, so you'll be able to see your community compared to other communities that show number of firefighters per 1,000 capita, total fire department budget per person that they pay per year. There'll be a bunch of comparators that allow communities to, again, support funding an effective model of public fire protection. Question period. Anyone have any questions?
Just picking up on what you were talking about at the end, because I was thinking of it all the way through. So SGI is now asking to be part of this program. You said earlier at the beginning that every 20 to 30 years, you did a review of each community. I'm assuming Saskatchewan hasn't been done in that period of time. So how up to date is the information now? First question. Related to that, as the administrator in Oxbow, can I just submit information and you accept it?
Yes. Yes. So absolutely, we have forms for you guys to submit information. I'd like to remind the communities, the onus is on you, the community, to prove to us the level of fire protection that you're providing. So we've set up a couple forms, fire station form, water supply form, risk assessment form, that provide a sort of standardized format that really fast tracks it to us. You don't have to use our format. You can use any format that you like to just get us the information about the fire protection programs that you have. When you submit that data, the surveyor will review it with you. He'll say, or he or she will say, that's great, we've got all that information into the index. We're going to also ask, can you provide this, this, and this? And over the course of a couple of back and forths, we'll actually get your grade information totally up to date, recalculated, and you'll be able to see your updated grade maps on the municipal portal. With respect to how up to date it currently is, yes, lots of communities are very out of date, although I think that over 100 communities have submitted data from Saskatchewan within the last 2 years. So even without us coming out, communities in Saskatchewan, I guess, are aware of what's going on. I don't know if SGI has been telling them, go ahead and send your stuff to FOSS. But we have reached out to a few communities and they've said, I don't know who you are. I sent my stuff to SGI 10 years ago, so leave us alone. One thing that we will be implementing to ensure that the data stays up to date is a 5-year expiry on the information. And what we'll do is in the grading index, if somebody, let's say, uploaded their information today, 5 years from today, that information would show as expired. And we would encourage the insurers to give less credit for expired information and to remind the local community to keep that information up to date. Good?
Yes, I'm Nicole Monchamp, the administrator for the town of Grenfell. I have 2 questions. One is, how do we contact you guys? You're asking for information, you're telling us about all these resources, but I have not heard how we're supposed to get hold of you.
Okay, so you can reach out to us through the website, fireunderwriters.ca. We also have opened up a new tool called the Municipal Portal that literally is just opening right now. I'm not sure, I think that we're going to change the URL for it. Mm-hmm. So I would recommend just going to the website, fireunderwriters.ca, and look for a link. And if you don't see the link to the municipal portal yet, then just click on the email us, and we'll send you a link, your username, and your password.
Okay. And then secondly, the municipal portal is only for fire chiefs, or is it for municipal administration as well?
This first iteration of it is just for the fire chief. The second iteration will be for the CAO. The third iteration will be for the water engineer. And later we'll actually be adding in fire prevention and emergency communications portals as well. Any other questions? Okay, if anything does come up, I've got a couple business cards here, so feel free to drop me an email. We have the website, fireunderwriters.ca. I'm sure questions will come up, so just reach out to us and we'll do our best to respond as quick as we can. Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it.